The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and endings. That chemical tang, sharp and antiseptic, had seeped into the cinder block walls of the dormitory for 4 years. It was the smell of move-in day and move-out day, of beginnings and conclusions, all blended into one sterile, forgettable scent. But today, it carried a different weight. Today, it smelled like the last page of a book being turned the cover, closing the story finished. Callum Wren stood in the doorway of his empty room, his hand resting on the doorframe, and let himself feel it. The bare mattress, the scuffed linoleum floor still damp from where he had mopped it, the single window smudged with fingerprints that were no longer his to clean. For 4 years, this 10 by 12 box had been the closest thing he had to a permanent address. Now it was just geometry. Four walls, a ceiling, a floor. Nothing in it belonged to him. Nothing in it ever really had. He could hear them outside. Through the thin walls and the propped open fire doors, the sounds of graduation day filtered in like music from a party he hadn't been invited to. Car doors slamming, laughter, the particular pitch of a mother's voice calling across a parking lot. He had watched them from his window earlier that morning in the families. Fathers in khaki pants loading boxes into SUVs. Mothers smoothing their daughters' hair one last time. Younger siblings running across the quad, giddy and bored in equal measure. There were balloons. There were flowers wrapped in cellophane. There were homemade signs taped to minivan windows that read, "Congratulations, graduate," in glitter paint. Callum had no balloons. He had no minivan. He had a single duffel bag, olive green, bought at a thrift store 3 years ago, and it contained everything he owned. 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, 2 paperback novels, their spines cracked from rereading, and a framed photograph he kept wrapped in a t-shirt at the very bottom, protected like something sacred. Because it was. He slung the bag over his shoulder. It wasn't heavy. That was the thing about owning nothing. You could carry it all. He walked to the front desk and placed his room key on the counter. The student worker behind the desk, a sophomore with earbuds in, didn't look up. She slid a clipboard toward him without a word. He signed his name on the checkout line. Callum Wren, room 412, date of departure. He set down the pen, and just like that, the last 4 years of his life were reduced to a signature on a form. Outside, the late May sun was warm on his face. The campus was beautiful, and it had always been beautiful, the kind of beauty designed to look timeless. Manicured lawns, old brick buildings with ivy crawling up their facades. Wrought iron benches beneath oak trees whose branches spread like open arms. It looked like a postcard. It looked like a promise. And it had been for a time. The scholarships, the grants, the loans. They had given him access to this world, but never membership. He had always been a guest here, and now his invitation had expired. He sat down on the front steps of the dormitory and set the duffel bag between his feet. The concrete was warm through his jeans. He watched a family loading a car across the lot. The father was trying to fit a mini fridge into the trunk, and the mother was laughing, and the graduate, a young woman with her cap still on, was taking a selfie with her younger brother. They were a unit, a system, a thing that worked together and moved together and had a place to go together. Callum had been part of systems his entire life. That was the word for it. Systems. First, the system of his mother's love, which had been warm and encompassing and absolute for the first 10 years of his life. Claire Wren. She smelled of soil and turpentine. She hummed while she painted low melodies that had no name, and she held his hand when they walked to the community garden on Saturday mornings. She grew tomatoes and marigolds and basil in a plot the size of a parking space, and she treated that little square of earth like it was a kingdom. She worked part-time at a plant nursery. She sold her paintings at local art fairs, watercolors, mostly landscapes and flowers, and she never sold many, but she didn't seem to mind. They lived in a small apartment with thin walls and radiators that clanked in the winter, and they had nothing, and they had everything. Then she died, a car accident when he was 10, a rainy Tuesday in October, a phone call to the school office, a principal with a careful voice and eyes that wouldn't meet his. And just like that, the first system collapsed completely, and without warning, the way a house falls when its foundation is pulled out from under it. The second system was the state, foster care. A series of homes that were not his home, families that were not his family. Some were kind, Some were indifferent. One was cruel in a quiet way that left no marks. He learned to be small. He learned to be useful. He learned to read the emotional weather of a room the moment he walked into it, the way a sailor reads the sky. He learned that being smart was his only currency, the only thing he had that anyone valued. So he was smart. He studied, he got scholarships, he got into college, he got out. The third system was the university itself. 4 years of structure, classes and deadlines and dining hall hours in a room that was his, even if it wasn't really his. It was a scaffolding, and he had built himself inside of it, and now the scaffolding was being taken down, and he was supposed to stand on his own. He was 22 years old. He had a degree in English literature. He had $50 in his checking account. He had $87,000 in student loan debt. He had no family, no home, no car, no job, and no plan beyond finding a hostel in the city and applying for work. Barista, warehouse, dishwasher, anything. The degree in English felt like a beautiful and practical thing, a handmade clock in a world that only cared about digital time. He had loved every minute of it, every poem, every novel. The way words could be arranged to build entire worlds to make a stranger feel something true. But the real world didn't run on metaphors. The real world ran on money, and he had none. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number. Probably a robocall about his student loans, the grace period, ending the payments, beginning the future arriving, whether he was ready or not. He almost let it go to voicemail. But something stopped him. Some instinct. Some small, stubborn flicker of something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Or just the reflex of a person who had learned never to ignore a phone call. Because in foster care, phone calls were how your life changed without your permission. He answered. Hello. Am I speaking with Callum Wren? The voice on the other end was dry and precise, like paper being folded along a crease. An old man's voice, but sharp. Yes, this is Callum. Mr. Wren, my name is Harold Whitfield. I'm an attorney. I was the legal counsel for your mother, Claire Wren. The world tilted. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but like a painting being hung at a wrong angle. Everything was the same, but nothing was straight. His mother. People didn't say her name anymore. She had been gone for 12 years, and the living had moved on as the living always do. She existed now only in his memory, and even those memories had worn smooth with handling like sea glass. He could still see her face, but only in a general way, the way you remember a room you once lived in. The broad strokes were there, the warmth, the smell of soil, the humming. But the details, the specific curve of her smile, the exact color of her eyes, those had faded into something soft and unreliable. My mother, he said, and his voice came out thin, like a wire pulled too tight. Yes, I've been attempting to reach you. The university registrar provided your contact information upon your graduation. There is a matter of her estate to discuss. It's not substantial in the traditional sense, but there are assets to be transferred now that you've reached the age of majority and completed your education as stipulated in her will. Estate, assets, will. The words didn't belong in the same sentence as his mother's name. Claire Wren had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet and a second-hand couch. She drove a car that needed 3 tries to start on cold mornings. She counted coins from a mason jar to buy art supplies. The state had covered her funeral costs. There was no estate. There were no assets. I don't understand, Callum said. There wasn't anything left. That's not entirely accurate, Mr. Wren. And there it was, a crack in the attorney's professional veneer, a warmth bleeding through like light under a door. It's a bit unorthodox. Could you come to my office? It would be best to discuss this in person. I've been informed that your campus housing has expired today. I imagine your schedule is somewhat flexible. Flexible, that was one way to put it. Another way was empty. His schedule was completely terrifyingly empty. Harold Whitfield gave him an address downtown 12 blocks south. Callum hung up the phone and sat on those steps for another full minute staring at the screen. Then he picked up his duffel bag and started walking. The bag grew heavier with every block. Not because anything had been added to it, but because the act of carrying everything you own through a city that doesn't know your name has a way of adding weight that isn't physical. He passed coffee shops full of people on laptops. He passed a bookstore with a window display of novels he had studied and loved. He passed a young couple arguing on a bench, and he envied them because they had someone to argue with. The building was old, the kind of old that used to mean important. A marble lobby scuffed and yellowed with age. A cage elevator operated by a man who looked like he had been operating it since the building was new. The elevator groaned upward, cables singing, and deposited Callum on the fourth floor. Harold Whitfield's office was small and overfull, every surface claimed by leather-bound books and manila folders and the particular organized chaos of a man who had practiced law for half a century. It smelled of dust, old paper, and furniture polish. The attorney himself was small and neat, a compact man in a tweed jacket with kind eyes behind thick glasses. He rose when Callum entered and extended a hand that was dry and firm. "Thank you for coming, Callum. Please sit." The leather chair sighed as Callum sank into it, as if it were relieved to be useful. Harold Whitfield settled behind a large mahogany desk and folded his hands on its surface. He studied Callum for a moment the way a man might study a photograph of someone he had heard about for years but never met. "Let me be direct," he said. "Your mother was a very forward-thinking woman, more than most people understood. After you were born, she took out a small life insurance policy. It wasn't much, but she invested it carefully. Then about a year before she passed, she liquidated the investment and purchased a piece of property." He slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. Callum's name was written on the front in a handwriting he recognized instantly, the way you recognize a voice in a crowd, the way you recognize the shape of the hand that once held yours. Claire Wren's handwriting, looping and slightly rushed, as if her thoughts moved faster than her pen. His throat tightened. He didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. He was afraid that if he touched it, the spell would break. "The property is rural," Harold continued, choosing his words with care. "Approximately 3 hours north of here. 5 acres of land in an unincorporated part of Sterling County. The property itself is unconventional. The sale was primarily for the land. The structure on it was included as is." He paused. "It's a Quonset hut." Callum blinked. "A Quonset hut?" "Yes, a semicircular structure of corrugated metal. Military surplus originally. They were common after the Second World War." "I know what it is," Callum said. He just couldn't understand why his mother had bought one. "She was very specific in her will," Harold said, unfolding his hands and pressing his fingertips together. "The deed was to be held in trust and transferred to you upon your 22nd birthday or your graduation from a 4-year university, whichever came later. She wanted to ensure you had completed your education before you took possession. She wanted you to have a foundation." A foundation. The word landed like a stone in still water. "Why didn't she tell me?" Callum asked. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Those were her instructions. She was a private person. I believe she intended this as a last resort, a fail-safe." Harold's voice softened. "She didn't want you to know about it unless you needed it, given your current circumstances." He let the silence finish the sentence. "You need it now." He pushed the envelope closer. "The deed is inside, officially transferred to your name. Property tax records. A set of keys and a letter from her to you." Callum reached for the envelope. His hand was trembling. He could feel the shape of the keys through the paper, cold and heavy. One was a standard key, the kind that fits a front door or a padlock. The other was large and industrial, the kind that belongs to something built to keep the world out. "There is one complication," Harold added, his tone shifting back to the careful register of business. "The property taxes have been paid automatically from a small account she set up, but that account is now depleted. The next payment is due in 6 months. It's not a large amount, but it is a liability." He paused again, and Callum could sense the next part coming, the way you sense rain before it falls. "Furthermore, I've received 2 inquiries about the land in the past year, from a developer, a company called Stone Ridge Holdings. They've been acquiring parcels in that area for a planned luxury retreat community. They don't know the property has been transferred to an individual. Their last offer was substantial." He named a figure, $250,000. The number hung in the air between them, bright and impossible, like a hallucination. $250,000. It was more money than Callum had ever conceived of possessing. It was enough to erase his debt, rent, and apartment, and live without terror for a year, maybe 2. It was enough to buy the ordinary anonymous safe life he had been planning to scrape together one minimum wage shift at a time. They want the land, Callum said. They want the land, Harold confirmed. He leaned back in his chair. Selling is an option, a very practical one. You could take the money and start fresh. No one would fault you. He looked at Callum, and behind those thick glasses, his eyes were steady and patient, the eyes of a man who had seen enough of life to know that some choices define everything that comes after. Or you could go see it, see what your mother wanted to give you. The choice should have been easy. The money was clean and simple, and it solved every problem. The Quonset hut was a riddle wrapped in rust 3 hours away, in a place he'd never been left by a woman who had been dead for more than half his life. But it was from her. It was the last thing she had ever done for him. The last act of a woman who knew she might not be around to see her son grow up, and who had spent her final year not grieving, not giving up, but building. Building something in secret for him. I have to see it, Callum said. The words came out before the thought was fully formed. It wasn't logic, it was gravity. Something pulling him toward a place he couldn't picture for reasons he didn't yet understand. Harold Whitfield nodded slowly. A small, sad, satisfied smile crossed his lips, the smile of a man who had been holding his breath for 12 years and could finally let it go. I thought you might say that. He handed Callum a bus schedule and $100 bill from his own wallet for the ticket and some supplies. It's a long ride. Callum stood the envelope pressed against his chest like a shield. One more thing, Harold said, rising to see him out. A week before the accident, your mother came to this office. She was not herself. She was agitated. She asked me to expedite the trust documents. She was very specific. She said, if anything happens to me, no one must know about the property. No one. Protect it for my son. Callum felt the ground shift beneath him. What does that mean? Harold held his gaze. I don't know. I've asked myself that question for 12 years. Perhaps the property itself will give you the answer. Perhaps the letter will. The bus station was 6 blocks east. Callum walked there in a state that felt like dreaming, kind of dream where the world is familiar but slightly wrong, where the light is too golden and the sounds are too sharp. He bought a one-way ticket north to a stop called Sterling Crossing that the woman behind the counter had to look up on a map. He sat in a plastic chair and held the manila envelope in his lap and tried to understand what was happening to him. 2 hours ago, he had been a man with no future. Now he had a future, but it was made of corrugated metal and mystery, and it was located in a place he couldn't find on his phone. The bus came. He boarded. He took a seat in the back by the window and pressed his forehead against the glass. The city fell away. The dense grid of concrete and glass gave way to suburbs, then to strip malls and highways, then to something else entirely. The landscape opened up and softened. The roads narrowed. Trees appeared at the edges of the asphalt, first in scattered clusters, then in dense ranks, their branches reaching over the road like arms forming an arch. They passed through small towns with single traffic lights, churches with white steeples, and diners with hand-painted signs. The towns grew smaller. The spaces between them grew wider. The sky grew larger. With every mile, Callum felt the known world receding and something older and wilder taking its place. He was the only passenger who got off at Sterling Crossing. It wasn't a station, it was a faded sign on the shoulder of a 2-lane road next to a gas station with rusted pumps in a convenience store with a screen door that banged in the wind. The cashier inside was a heavy man with a weathered face and curious eyes. He watched Callum walk in the way people in small places watch strangers, not with hostility, but with the frank, unapologetic attention of someone who doesn't see new faces often enough to pretend otherwise. Help you, he said. I'm heading to a property on Old Mill Road, Callum said, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. The cashier's eyebrows rose. Old Mill ain't it nothing down that way but the old hemlock plot and a whole lot of trees. You sure? I'm sure. The man shrugged. Suit yourself. It's a good 3 miles. Take a right at the fork. He paused, then added as if it were an afterthought, but wasn't used to be a woman came out that way sometimes years back. Drove a little hatchback, always had dirt on her boots. Then one day she just stopped coming. Never saw her again. Callum's chest tightened. That was my mother. The cashier looked at him differently then, not with pity, with something closer to recognition. Well, he said quietly, I'll be. The walk was 3 miles of transformation. The asphalt gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to packed dirt. The trees pressed closer with every step closing overhead until the road was a tunnel of green, the light filtering through the canopy in broken, shifting patterns. The air was different here. It smelled of damp earth and pine needles and something ancient and undisturbed. The only sounds were his footsteps, the buzz of insects, and the occasional call of a bird he couldn't name. He followed the hand-drawn map Harold had included in the envelope. A simple line with a simple X. His heart was a fist pounding against his ribs. The duffel bag cut into his shoulder. The sweat ran down his back. This was insane. He could have been in a hostel right now filling out job applications on a library computer. Instead, he was walking into the woods chasing a dead woman's secret. The developer's offer shimmered in his mind like a mirage. $250,000. Safety. Simplicity. Escape. He could still turn around. He could walk back to the gas station, call Harold and say, sell it. He could have a normal life. But he kept walking. His mother had walked this same road. Her boots had crunched on this same gravel. She had come here alone carrying her own secrets, her own fears, her own fierce and private hope. And she had done it for him. The least he could do was finish the walk. And then he saw it. Through a break in the tree line rising from a clearing, like the curved back of some enormous sleeping animal, was the Quonset hut. It was larger than he had imagined and more desolate. The corrugated metal was streaked with rust orange and brown rivulets running down the curved walls like dried tears. The clearing around it was choked with weeds and saplings, nature reclaiming what had been briefly taken from it. Attached to the hut on its east side like a fragile wing was a greenhouse. Its frame was steel, still sturdy, but the glass panes were clouded with years of grime, and several were cracked or missing entirely, leaving jagged and empty holes through which the wind whispered. The whole place sagged with a heavy, heartbreaking neglect. It didn't look like a foundation. It looked like something the world had forgotten. A gravel driveway barely visible beneath the weeds led to the front. The main door was a large sliding slab of metal painted a red that had once been bright and was now faded and peeling in long curling strips. Callum dropped his duffel bag on the ground and pulled the keys from the envelope with shaking hands. The large industrial key slid into the lock with a grating metallic screech. It took both hands and all his strength to turn it. The lock clanked open, a sound that echoed across the empty clearing like a gunshot. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed. It groaned, scraping along a rust-caked track, and slid open just enough for him to slip through. The air inside was cold and still, as if it had been waiting. It smelled of dust-damp concrete and the sharp, sour musk of mice. A single bar of light cut through the gloom from the partially open door, illuminating a universe of floating dust motes that swirled like slow galaxies. The interior was one vast, cavernous space. The curved metal walls arched overhead, amplifying every sound, turning his breathing into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The floor was bare concrete, cracked and stained. And it was empty, completely devastatingly empty. No furniture, no boxes, no sign that anyone had ever lived here or loved here or planned anything here. Just a huge echoing void beneath a shell of corrugated steel. The disappointment was physical. It hit him in the chest and in the gut and behind the eyes. He stood in the center of that enormous empty space and he felt like the loneliest person on earth. This was the failsafe. This was what his mother had spent her final year building. An empty metal shell in the middle of nowhere surrounded by weeds and silence. The developer's offer was no longer just an option. It was the only sane choice. He was a fool, a grief-stricken, sentimental fool, who had turned down a bus ticket to a hostel and walked 3 miles into the woods to find a whole lot of nothing. He turned to leave, and then his eyes, adjusting now to the dim light, caught something in the far corner. A dark shape against the wall, almost lost in the shadows. Not large, but definite. Something that didn't belong to the emptiness. He walked toward it, his boots crunched on grit and small debris, the sound absurdly loud in the vaulted space. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a military-style footlocker, painted olive drab, sitting on the concrete like a patient, faithful animal. It was locked with a simple padlock. His heart was beating in his ears. He fumbled with the key ring. The smaller key, the one that looked like it belonged to a diary or a child's treasure chest fit the padlock. He knelt on the cold floor. The key turned. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 12 years. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cheesecloth, was a shoebox. An ordinary cardboard shoebox held shut with a thick rubber band that had gone brittle with age. And on top of the shoebox, a sealed envelope. His name, Callum, was written on it in her hand. He sat down on the concrete floor right there, cross-legged, like a child, and held the envelope in both hands. The paper was cream-colored and thick. He could feel the weight of the pages inside. He worked the flap open carefully as if the letter were alive and could be hurt. 3 sheets of folded paper. Her handwriting, that familiar looping script, slightly faded but unmistakable. He unfolded the pages, took a breath that tasted of dust and time, and something like prayer, and began to read. My dearest Callum, if you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, that you have become the wonderful young man I always knew you would be, educated, strong, and of an age to make your own way in the world. And second, it means that I have failed you in the most fundamental way a mother can. It means you are alone, and you have come here because you have nowhere else to go. For that, my love, I am so sorry. The tears came immediately. He didn't try to stop them. They fell on the paper, darkening small circles in the cream-colored page, and he wiped them away with the heel of his hand, terrified of smudging her words. I know this place must be a shock. A metal hut in the woods. It's not a home. Not yet. I bought it with the last of the money from your grandparents in a small insurance policy I took out on myself. I bought it in secret because I was scared, Callum. There were things happening in my life, things I tried to protect you from. Before you were born, I was involved with a man. I made mistakes. I borrowed money from people who don't forgive debts. I thought I had gotten away, that I had started over with you clean and new. But they found me, they started making threats. It was a shadow that followed me everywhere, a constant fear that they would come and take what little we had. His blood went cold. He thought of his mother, sunny and warm, humming in the kitchen, painting in the light from the apartment window. The idea of her living under the weight of that kind of fear, hiding it behind that smile, was almost impossible to hold in his mind. She had been so good at protecting him, so good at making the world seem safe. This place was my escape plan, my in case of emergency break glass plan for you. I came out here on weekends when you were with friends, telling you I was at an art retreat. I cleaned it out. I made plans. The greenhouse, that was the key. I grew up on a small farm, Callum. I know things about the earth. I was going to grow things here, not just food, things that are valuable. Medicinal herbs, rare botanicals, things that could provide a real sustainable life off the grid, away from anyone who could ever hurt us. I was building a fortress for you, my boy, disguised as a ruin. He looked up from the letter through the grime-caked door that connected the hut to the greenhouse. Through the clouded glass, he could see the faint outlines of long, empty planting beds and rotting wooden shelves. It wasn't just a greenhouse. It was an ark, a vessel built to carry one person through a flood. I ran out of time. The ink was smudged here, blurred by a drop of water that had fallen on the page long before his own tears. She had been crying when she wrote this. His mother, alone at a desk somewhere, writing a letter to a son she was afraid she might not live to raise, had wept on this very page. The accident wasn't part of the plan, but this place is. It's yours. The land is paid for. It's clean. No one knows about it. It's a clean slate, a place where no debts can follow you. Inside the shoebox, you'll find the beginning. Everything I was saving. It's not much, but it's a start. And know this, Callum. Every weed I pulled, every shelf I built, I did it picturing your face. I did it so that if the worst ever happened, you would have a piece of ground that was yours. A place to plant your feet, a place to grow, and then the last lines, and they broke him. Don't trust everything people say about how I died. And if anyone ever comes looking for this land, anyone named Dominic Reed, don't sell, don't engage. Just hold on to what's yours. You are my best crop, Callum, my most beautiful creation. Make a life for yourself. Be happy. That is all I ever wanted. I love you forever, Mom. He dropped the letter and wept, not the quiet, restrained grief of an adult who has learned to manage his pain. Deep, ragged, shaking sobs that came from a place 12 years deep from the 10-year-old boy who had been pulled out of class and told that his mother was gone and that his life as he knew it was over. He cried for that boy. He cried for the man that boy had become, who had carried his loneliness like a stone in his chest for more than a decade. But most of all, he cried for her, for the woman who had lived in secret terror, for the mother who had driven out to this desolate place on weekends alone, telling her son she was going to an art retreat and had instead pulled weeds and scrubbed concrete and built shelves in a greenhouse, all so that if the worst happened, her boy would have a place to land. The Quonset hut was no longer empty. It was filled with her, with the ghost of her labor, her fear, her ferocious and desperate love. The curved metal walls were not a shell. They were arms. She had built this place to hold him when she no longer could. The shoebox sat in his lap. He slipped off the brittle rubber band and lifted the lid. Inside, packed with meticulous care, were dozens of small paper envelopes, each one hand-labeled in her writing. Ginseng, golden seal, black cohosh, echinacea, bloodroot. Names he didn't fully recognize, but their intent was clear. These were not garden vegetables. These were rare, valuable, difficult-to-grow botanicals. This was a business plan compressed into seed packets. Beneath the packets was a small leather-bound journal. He opened it. Her handwriting filled every page. Soil pH levels, germination times, sunlight requirements, drying techniques, sketches of the greenhouse layout with measurements and notes, list of organic fertilizer suppliers, a calendar of planting cycles. It was a complete blueprint for a self-sustaining botanical operation written by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Tucked into the back cover of the journal was a folded bank statement, a savings account in his name with a balance of $5,112.42. And at the bottom in her hand for the first year's taxes and supplies. Use it wisely, my love. $5,000, not a fortune. But it was the difference between drowning and treading water. It was the difference between no choice and one choice. It was a crack of light under a locked door. He sat on that cold concrete floor as the bar of sunlight from the open door stretched long and golden across the ground, shifting with the slow turning of the earth. The silence of the hut was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a place that was waiting for him to decide. The developer's offer was still there glowing in his mind. $250,000, safety, escape, a warm apartment, a zero balance. A normal anonymous life in a city where no one would ever know his name or his story or his mother's secret. Or this, dirt and rust and broken glass and a box of seeds and a dead woman's handwritten instructions for how to build a life from nothing. He looked at the letter again, that last line, the one that had turned his blood to ice. Don't trust everything people say about how I died. What did that mean? What was she trying to tell him? And the name Dominic Reed. A name she had carried like a wound, a name connected to the debts, the threats, the shadow that had followed her. He didn't have answers. He had questions, and they were multiplying, and the only place that might hold the answers was this piece of ground, this metal shell, this ruin that his mother had tried to turn into a fortress. Night came. The light through the open door turned orange, then purple, then blue, then gone. The temperature dropped. The sounds of the woods pressed in, amplified by the metal walls into something vast and alien. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the brush. Callum unrolled his sleeping bag on the clean patch of floor and used his duffel as a pillow. The concrete pulled the warmth from his body. He lay in the dark, staring up at the curve of the ceiling, and he thought about two futures. One was a check, clean, easy, final, a transaction. Money for land. His mother's last hope converted into a number deposited into an account and spent on rent and groceries until it was gone. The other was this floor, this cold, hard, merciless floor, and the work that would begin tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. Work he didn't know how to do, a plan he didn't know how to execute, a life he couldn't yet imagine. But she had imagined it. She had stood in this exact spot and pictured him here. She had written his name on an envelope and filled a shoebox with seeds and left them in the dark, trusting that he would come, trusting that he would stay. The developer wanted the land. The money would save him. But his mother's letter had redefined what salvation meant. She hadn't wanted him to be saved. She had wanted him to save himself. He didn't sleep that night. But somewhere in the darkest hour, when the silence was absolute and the cold had seeped into his bones and the fear was a living thing curled around his chest, he made his decision. He would stay. Not because he was brave, not because he had a plan, but because this was the last thing his mother had ever given him, and he would not let it go. He would stand on this ground. He would open that journal in the morning. He would learn the names of the seeds she had saved, and he would plant them. The first light of dawn came through the open door, pale and gray and new. Callum sat up on the hard floor, stiff and aching, and reached for his mother's journal. He opened it to the first page, and he began to read. The first morning began with silence and hunger. Callum stood in the open doorway of the Quonset hut, the journal in one hand, a bottle of water in the other, and looked out at the clearing in the flat gray light of early dawn. The world was wet. A heavy dew had settled overnight, and every blade of grass, every weed, every rusted surface was beaded with moisture that caught the first weak light and held it. The air smelled of pine and damp earth and the green living scent of things growing, whether anyone wanted them to or not. The weeds were extraordinary. They rose from the ground around the hut in dense tangled walls, some as high as his chest, thick-stemmed and defiant. Thistle, ragweed, wild grapevines climbing the sides of the greenhouse, their tendrils working into the gaps between the glass panes like fingers prying open a wound. Nature had been busy in the years since his mother's last visit. It had been patient and relentless, and it had nearly won. He ate the last of the beef jerky he had bought at the gas station in Sterling Crossing. He drank water from the bottle. He had no stove, no refrigerator, no running water. The nearest town was 13 miles away. He had $5,000 in a bank account he couldn't access. Without driving to a branch, a $100 bill in his pocket, minus the cost of the bus ticket, and a duffel bag full of clothes and books. He opened the journal to the first page. His mother's handwriting, small and precise, filled the margins around a sketch of the greenhouse layout. At the top of the page, underlined twice, she had written a single sentence. Start with the ground, everything else follows. He closed the journal, set it on the footlocker, and picked up the only tool available to him, a rusted garden spade he had found leaning against the inside wall of the greenhouse. The handle was cracked. The blade was dull. It would have to do. He started pulling weeds. The work was brutal in its simplicity. Bend, grip, pull, toss, repeat. The thistle fought back, its roots deep and stubborn, its stems covered in fine spines that pierced through his thin cotton gloves within the first hour. By noon, his hands were raw and bleeding in 3 places. His back was a column of fire. He had cleared a space roughly 10 feet square in front of the greenhouse door. 10 feet, out of 5 acres. The scale of what he was attempting hit him like a wave, and he sat down in the dirt and put his head in his hands and laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who understands with perfect clarity the absurdity of his situation. He was 22 years old, an English literature major, sitting in the dirt, in the middle of nowhere, bleeding from his hands, trying to clear a field with a broken spade. But he got up. He got up because there was nothing behind him to go back to, and because the only alternative to forward was down. By the end of the first day, he had cleared a path from the hut door to the greenhouse door. It was narrow and rough, the ground still studded with root stumps, but it was a path, a line drawn through the chaos, a beginning. He slept on the concrete floor again that night. His muscles screamed, his hands throbbed. He dreamed of his mother, not as he remembered her, but as she must have been out here alone, pulling the same weeds, fighting the same thorns, her boots caked with the same mud. He woke in the dark with tears on his face and the absolute certainty that he could not do this alone. The next morning, he walked the 3 miles back to the gas station. The cashier remembered him. Of course he did. In a place like this, a new face was news for a week. Back already, he said. Figured the woods might have swallowed you up. Not yet, Callum said. I need a ride into town. Is there a taxi service around here? The cashier snorted. Taxi service, that's generous. There's Glenn Tully. He's got a truck and he'll drive you places for money. That's about as close as we get to a taxi out here. He wrote a phone number on the back of a receipt. Callum called it from outside the gas station, standing in the gravel lot, watching a hawk circle in the pale morning sky. The voice that answered was gravel and cigarettes. Yeah, I'm looking for a ride into town. The cashier at the Sterling Crossing station gave me your number. You the kid who bought the Hemlock plot? Word traveled fast out here. Or maybe there was simply so little of it that every new piece found its audience immediately. I didn't buy it, I inherited it. A pause, then, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Glenn Tully arrived in a Ford pickup that was older than Callum and showed every year. The paint had faded from blue to a pale, exhausted gray. The bed was scarred with the marks of 1,000 loads. The man behind the wheel matched the truck weathered lean somewhere in his 60s with deep lines around his eyes and hands that looked like they had spent their entire lives gripping things. Tools, ropes, steering wheels, the handles of problems. He didn't get out. He just leaned across and pushed the passenger door open. Get in. They drove in silence for the first few miles. Glenn didn't seem like a man who felt compelled to fill quiet spaces with talk. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the open window frame, his eyes on the road, his jaw working slowly on a toothpick. So, he said finally, the Hemlock plot. Yes, that place has been sitting empty since I can remember. 10 years, maybe more. Folks figured it had just rot back into the ground. Then the land company started sniffing around, buying up parcels all over the county. They made offers on half the properties between here and Ridgefield. He glanced at Callum. They make you an offer, $250,000. Glenn's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. That was Callum would learn the Glenn Tully equivalent of falling out of his chair in shock. And you're still here, Glenn said. It wasn't a question. I'm still here. Glenn nodded. He didn't ask why. He seemed to understand that some decisions don't come with explanations that fit neatly into conversation. He just drove, and the toothpick moved from one side of his mouth to the other, and the trees scrolled past the windows like a green curtain being drawn. The town of Sterling was small in the way that towns are small when they exist not because anyone planned them, but because people needed a place to buy nails and bread and gasoline. A hardware store, a grocery store, a library built of red brick with a copper roof gone green, a diner with a hand-painted sign that said, Maze, and a parking lot full of pickup trucks, a post office, a church, a gas station that was newer and slightly less rusted than the one at Sterling Crossing. Callum went to the hardware store first. He paid with cash from the $100 bill and the change Harold had given him, plus a withdrawal from the savings account that the hardware store owner processed through a phone call to the bank that took 15 minutes and required Callum to answer 4 security questions. Small-town banking. Glenn helped him load everything into the truck bed without being asked. He moved with the efficient, unhurried economy of a man who had loaded trucks 10,000 times and saw no reason to make a production of it. You need anything else? Glenn asked, slamming the tailgate shut. A ride back, and maybe a coffee. Glenn almost smiled. It was hard to tell with Glenn. The corners of his mouth moved, but the rest of his face stayed where it was. They went to May's Diner. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 40 years and didn't intend to. Vinyl booths with cracked seats, a Formica counter with chrome stools. Something more practical and less sentimental. He was the man with the truck. He showed up when Callum needed supplies. He showed up some mornings when Callum didn't need anything at all, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from May's and a bag of donuts, and he'd lean against the hood of his truck and watch Callum work and offer no advice unless asked. When Callum asked, the advice was good. You're digging too shallow, Glenn said one morning, watching him prepare a bed for the cold frames. Roots need room. Give them room and they'll do the rest. Crowd them and they'll fight each other instead of growing. Callum looked at him. You know about farming. I know about growing things, Glenn said, which was not the same answer, but was somehow more complete. My father grew tobacco. I swore I'd never farm a day in my life. Drove trucks for 40 years. Now I drive people. He took a sip of his coffee. Turns out you can't outrun the dirt. It follows you. The first week bled into the second, and the second into the third, and the work consumed everything. There was no time for thinking, no energy for doubt. There was only the next task and the task after that, and the slow grinding process of turning chaos into order. Callum cleared the weeds from around the hut in the greenhouse. He tarped the broken panes, stretching the heavy blue plastic over the gaps and securing it with caulk and duct tape, creating a crude but functional seal against the wind and rain. He cleaned the greenhouse floor, sweeping out years of debris, dead leaves, animal droppings, broken glass, the skeletal remains of plants that had once grown here and died when no one came to tend them. He scrubbed the concrete floor of the Quonset hut until his arms ached and the water in his bucket turned black. He set up a proper living space in one corner, his sleeping bag on a foam pad he bought in town, his camp stove on a flat piece of plywood, his few supplies arranged on a shelf he built from scrap lumber he found stacked behind the hut. It was sparse and rough, but it was organized. It was his. Every evening he sat on the overturned bucket in the greenhouse and read his mother's journal by lantern light. Her instructions were detailed and specific. She had planned everything, every measurement, every material, every phase of construction. The greenhouse was meant to be rebuilt in stages. First, stabilize the frame. Second, replace the glass. Third, rebuild the planting beds. Fourth, install irrigation. Fifth, begin germination. He was on stage 1. Stage 5 felt like it existed in another lifetime. It was during the third week, while clearing a thicket of thorny brush that had grown thick against the back wall of the Quonset hut, that the shovel hit something that wasn't earth. The sound was flat and metallic, unmistakable. Not a rock, not a root, something made by hands. He dug around it, his pulse quickening. The thorns tore at his arms, drawing thin lines of blood that he ignored. He worked the shovel blade along the edges of the object, scraping away dirt and clay and years of accumulated leaf mulch. A flat metal panel emerged from the ground, set flush against the concrete foundation of the hut, hidden below the dirt line. It had a small recessed handle, rusted but intact. A door, a cellar door. It wasn't on any of the documents Harold had given him. It wasn't mentioned in his mother's first letter. She had hidden it. His hands were trembling as he worked his fingers into the recessed handle. The door was heavy, sealed by years of dirt and corrosion. He jammed the shovel blade into the seam and put his full weight on the handle, using it as a lever. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the seal broke and the door shifted upward. A breath of cool, earth-scented air rose from the dark opening like a sigh from underground. He propped the door open with a rock and peered down. Steep wooden steps, gray with age, descended into darkness. The smell was cave-like, cool stone and still air, and the faint sweetness of old wood. He grabbed his lantern and went down. The cellar was small, roughly 10 feet by 10, lined with poured concrete that had held up well against the moisture. Along one wall, a row of empty wooden shelves, clearly built for storing preserved food. The craftsmanship was simple but careful. His mother's hands had built these shelves. He could tell by the way the corners were joined, the same slightly imperfect but sturdy method she had used on the bookshelves in their old apartment. Against the far wall, pushed into the deepest shadow, were 2 large sealed plastic tubs and another military-style footlocker identical to the one he had found upstairs. His mother had designed a test. The first footlocker, the one in the hut, was the obvious find. Anyone who came here, whether out of curiosity or greed, would find the shoebox, take the seeds and the small savings account, and leave satisfied that they had found everything. They would never think to clear the thorns behind the building. They would never dig in the dirt. They would never find the hidden door. But someone who stayed, someone who did the work, someone who put their hands in the earth and their back into the labor. That person would find this. She had buried her real treasure beneath the ground, trusting that only the right person, someone willing to fight the thorns, would ever uncover it. He knelt before the footlocker. His hands were steady, now calmer than they had been upstairs 3 weeks ago. Something had changed in him. The work had changed him. The daily rhythm of physical labor, the simple and brutal honesty of dirt and sweat and blisters, had stripped away a layer of something, fear maybe, or the particular kind of paralysis that comes from having too many choices and no foundation to make them from. He opened the lid. Cash. Neat plastic-wrapped bundles of 20s, 50s, and 100s, packed tightly and efficiently, the way a person packs something they expect to last. He didn't count it, not yet. He just stared at it, the stacks of bills glowing in the lantern light like something out of a story he would have read in his English literature classes, a buried treasure, a dragon's hoard, a fairy tale made real. On top of the bundles, another letter, thicker than the first. He lifted it carefully and sat down on the cellar steps, the cold concrete pressing through his jeans, the lantern on the step beside him casting a warm circle of light that pushed back the dark. My clever, hard-working boy. If you found this, it means you chose the hard path. It means you stayed. It means you are your mother's son. I am so proud of you. I can't even find the words, and you know how I feel about words. He had to stop. His throat was thick, his eyes burning. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes and breathed until he could see clearly again. This is the real inheritance, Callum. It's everything I saved, everything I scraped together over years. It's not tainted money. I need you to understand that. It's from my art, from working 2 jobs, from living on next to nothing for years so that you could have everything. I sold my car. I sold my own mother's jewelry, the only thing she left me. Every dollar in this box was earned with clean hands. It should be enough to fix the greenhouse properly, to buy the supplies you need, to live for a year or two without worrying about anything but the work. It's your seed money in every sense of the word. But the money is the least important thing here, Callum. The most important thing is the choice you made to earn it. The world will always offer you an easy way out. There will always be a man in a suit with a checkbook promising to solve your problems with a number, but real value, real security doesn't come from a check. It comes from the ground up. It comes from your own 2 hands. It comes from building something that is yours, something that can sustain you, something no one can take away. That's the lesson I wanted to give you. That's the only legacy that matters. The tubs are filled with more supplies, preserved food, tools, more books, everything you need to get started. The business plan is in the journal. It's a slow business, Callum, a patient one. The herbs you'll be growing take years to mature. Ginseng takes 5 to 7 years. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a get-a-life-slow scheme. It's a way to be independent, to be free in the way I always wanted to be free and never was. I have one last thing to ask of you. Live, Callum. Don't just survive here. Live. Make friends in the town. Plant a vegetable garden for yourself, not just for business, but for the pleasure of eating something you grew with your own hands. Read your books. Fall in love if you can. Fill this big, empty metal building with life and laughter and warmth. Let it be a home. My only regret is that I won't be there to see it. All my love forever and after Mom. He counted the money that night sitting on the cellar steps with the lantern between his feet. He counted it twice because the first time he didn't believe the number. $82,400. He held the figure in his mind and tried to understand what it meant. His mother, who had worn the same winter coat for 6 years, who had cut his hair herself because barbers cost money, who had eaten rice and beans 3 nights a week so that he could have chicken. She had saved $82,000, one $5 bill at a time, one painting sale at a time, one skipped meal at a time. It was not a fortune in the way the world measures fortunes, but it was a fortune of sacrifice. Every dollar in that box had been purchased with something she had denied herself, and she had done it for him. The money changed the equation. It did not change the work. The greenhouse was the heart of everything. Without it, the seeds were just paper packets. Without it, his mother's plan was just words in a journal. The greenhouse had to be rebuilt, and it had to be rebuilt right. He ordered custom-cut panes of tempered glass from a supplier in the city 50 miles south. Glenn drove him to pick them up in the truck, and they spent an entire day wrapping each pane in moving blankets and loading them carefully because a single crack meant a wasted pane and wasted money. The glass was the single largest expense, nearly $4,000, and watching the money leave his account felt like surgery necessary but painful. The reglazing took weeks. He worked from the bottom up, one pane at a time, setting each piece into the steel frame with glazing putty that he had to warm between his hands before it would spread. The work required patience he didn't know he had. Each pane had to be perfectly seated, perfectly sealed. A gap meant a draft, and a draft meant temperature fluctuation, and temperature fluctuation meant dead plants. His mother's journal was specific on this point. She had underlined it 3 times. While the glass went in, he tore out the rotted wooden planting beds inside the greenhouse and built new ones from cedar planks, which Glenn told him were naturally resistant to moisture and decay. He built them to the exact dimensions in the journal, 3 feet wide, 18 inches deep, 12 feet long. 4 beds running the length of the greenhouse, like parallel rivers of dark waiting earth. He ran new irrigation lines from the creek that cut through the back of the property, installing a small solar-powered pump that he found in one of the plastic tubs in the cellar, already purchased by his mother, still in its original packaging. She had thought of everything. She had bought the pump years ago, anticipating the day her son would need it, and had stored it in the dark, trusting time and love and the stubbornness of blood. The first seeds went into germination trays on a Tuesday in late June. He set up a clean corner of the Quonset hut as a nursery rigging grow lights from hooks in the curved ceiling, running extension cords from a small generator he had purchased in town. The ginseng seeds went into trays of sterile potting mix, each seed placed individually with his fingers, spaced exactly as the journal instructed. Then the golden seal, then the black cohosh, then the echinacea. He watered them with creek water. He checked the temperature of the soil with a thermometer. He adjusted the lights. He followed his mother's instructions with the devotion of a man performing a sacred ritual, because that is what it was. On the 7th day after planting, the first sprout emerged. A single pale green thread no thicker than an eyelash pushing up through the dark surface of the soil. Ginseng, the most valuable, the most difficult, the most patient of all the seeds his mother had saved. Callum stood over this tray, his hands dirty, his back aching, his face unshaved, and he stared at that tiny green filament, and something broke open in his chest. It was alive. It was growing. Out of the darkness, out of the dormancy of years, in a sealed envelope, in a locked box, in an empty building, this seed had felt the warmth and the water and the light, and it had decided to live. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He understood then what his mother had meant. The seeds were not just seeds. They were her last words to him, encoded in biology, written in the language of growth and patience and time. She was speaking to him through the soil. She was saying, I am still here. I am still with you. Look what we can build. Life outside the property began to take shape slowly, the way a photograph develops in solution, the image emerging from blankness in gradual, uncertain stages. It started at the library. She almost smiled. What are you growing out there? Ginseng, golden seal, medicinal herbs. She looked at him with new interest. Wild simulated or woods grown? He blinked. He didn't know the difference. He said so. She disappeared into the stacks and came back with a thick volume on Appalachian botanical cultivation and a USDA pamphlet on forest farming. Start with these, she said. Come back when you finish them and we'll talk. He came back. They talked. First about ginseng cultivation and soil amendment and the economics of the herbal supplement market. Then about books. She had read everything widely and without prejudice, fiction and nonfiction, poetry and field guides, and she talked about all of it with the same precise, unadorned intelligence. Callum found himself looking forward to his library visits with an intensity that surprised him. Not just for the books, for the conversation, for the simple, sustaining pleasure of being known by another person. Then there was Walt Pemberton. Walt was 73 years old and had farmed the same 60 acres west of Sterling for his entire adult life. He was built like a fence post, lean and weathered and impossible to knock over. He wore the same canvas jacket in every season and communicated primarily through grunts, nods, and occasional sentences that arrived like telegrams, short, direct, and stripped of anything unnecessary. Callum met him at May's Diner on a Saturday morning. He had started going there for breakfast on weekends, sitting at the counter eating scrambled eggs and toast, listening to the slow rhythm of small-town morning conversation. Walt sat 2 stools down, eating the same thing he apparently ate every Saturday: oatmeal black coffee, a single strip of bacon, and he watched Callum with the frank, unblinking attention of a man who had spent his life observing things grow and could spot a newcomer the way he could spot a weed in a bean row. "You the one on the hemlock plot," Walt said. Again, not a question. "Yes, sir." "Growing ginseng." "Trying to." Walt grunted. He chewed his bacon slowly. Then he said, "Come by my place Tuesday. I got something for you." Callum went on Tuesday. Walt's farm was neat and modest, a white clapboard house with a wraparound porch and a red barn and rows of vegetables marching across the fields in precise, disciplined lines. Walt met him at the porch with a cardboard box. Inside the box were 12 tomato seedlings, their leaves bright green and reaching upward. "Every man needs a decent tomato," Walt said gruffly. "Can't live on herbs and ambition. You plant these along the south side of that hut, they'll get enough sun. Water them in the evening, not the morning, and don't let the deer get at them." Callum planted them the next day. He tilled a small patch of earth just outside the Quonset hut, breaking the ground with the shovel, turning the soil, working in compost from a pile he had started behind the hut, with food scraps and leaf mulch. He set each seedling, carefully spacing them, the way Walt had told him, pressing the soil firm around each stem. He planted lettuce too, and carrots, and a row of potatoes from seed stock he bought at the hardware store. It was a small garden, humble and unambitious, but it was his. He was growing food. He was feeding himself from the ground his mother had bought for him. The Quonset hut was slowly transforming. He used some of the money to have a well drilled and a hand pump installed, giving him clean water without the daily trip to the creek. He bought a wood stove, a cast iron box with a flat top for cooking, and had Glenn help him cut and stack firewood from deadfall in the surrounding woods. He built a bed frame from scrap lumber, a simple platform raised off the cold concrete, and bought a real mattress, a used one from a secondhand store in town that smelled faintly of lavender and someone else's life. He built a shelf for his books. He bought a reading chair at a yard sale, a deep, worn armchair with stuffing coming out of one arm. He patched the arm with duct tape and set the chair by the wood stove and draped a wool blanket over the back. At night, he sat in that chair with a book and a cup of coffee brewed on the camp stove, and the wood stove crackled and threw warm light across the curved walls, and the rain on the metal roof made a sound that was no longer lonely, but intimate, like a conversation between the sky and his home. Home. The word had begun to feel possible, and then Stone Ridge came back. It was a Tuesday evening in early September. The air had changed, carrying the first cool edge of autumn, the light turning golden and slanting through the trees at a lower angle. Callum was in the greenhouse checking the ginseng trays when he noticed it. Boot prints, heavy, deep impressions in the soft earth along the outside of the greenhouse wall. They were not his. His boots were size 10, well-worn, with a distinctive crack across the left sole that left a visible mark. These prints were larger, deeper, made by someone heavier and wearing new boots with sharp treads. Someone had been on his property. Someone had walked along the greenhouse wall, slowly, deliberately looking in through the glass. A cold wire of fear tightened in his stomach. He followed the prints around the perimeter of the greenhouse. They circled the entire structure, pausing at each window, then continued around the back of the Quonset hut and out toward the tree line where they disappeared into the leaf litter of the forest floor. Someone had been here, watching, evaluating. He told himself it was nothing. A hiker, a hunter cutting through, a curious local. He told himself this, and he almost believed it. 3 days later, he woke before dawn to a sound that didn't belong to the woods. A sharp, percussive crack followed by the musical tinkling of falling glass. Then another crack, and another. He was out of bed and running before he was fully awake, his boots unlaced, his heart slamming against his ribs. He threw open the greenhouse door, and the lantern light fell on devastation. 3 of the new glass panes, the ones he had spent weeks installing, were shattered. The glass lay in jagged, glittering fragments across the planting beds and the concrete floor. The cold night air poured in through the gaping holes in the temperature inside the greenhouse, which he had carefully maintained at 65 degrees, for the germination trays was already dropping. But it was the planting beds that broke him. 2 of the 4 cedar beds had been trampled, not by an animal. The boot prints were there again, the same large, sharp-treaded prints pressed deep into the soil. Seedlings were crushed. Young golden seal plants, 8 weeks of careful tending, reduced to green smears in the dirt. And on one of the shattered panes, still hanging in the frame, a piece of paper had been taped. A single word written in block letters with a thick black marker. Sell. Callum stood in the ruined greenhouse, the lantern shaking in his hand, and felt something he hadn't felt since the first night on the concrete floor. The urge to quit. The desire to call Harold Whitfield and say the words, "I'm done. Sell it. Send me the check. Let me go." The developer's offer recalculated in his head, inflating with every broken pane, every crushed seedling. 400,000, Victor Hale would probably say now if Callum called. Maybe more. Because they wanted this land badly enough to send someone in the dark to break his glass and crush his plants and leave a one-word threat taped to the wreckage. He sat down on the greenhouse floor among the broken glass and the ruined soil, and he put his face in his hands. The cold air moved through the broken panes and touched his skin, and he shivered, and he was very close to being finished. But then he looked at his hands. The blisters had become calluses. The skin that had been soft and academic 3 months ago was now rough and brown and cracked. These hands had pulled weeds and cut glass and turned soil and planted seeds. These hands had built beds and repaired pipes and chopped wood. These were not the hands of the boy who had sat on the dormitory steps with a duffel bag and $50 and no idea where to go. These were different hands. They had been remade by the work, and the work was not done. He stood up. He swept the glass. He assessed the damage. 2 beds destroyed, 2 intact. The ginseng in its trays inside the Quonset hut was untouched. They hadn't gotten inside the hut. The most valuable plants were safe. The golden seal in the trampled beds was gone. 8 weeks of growth finished, but there were more seeds. His mother had packed dozens of envelopes. He could start again. He covered the broken panes with tarps, working by lantern light in the pre-dawn cold, his fingers numb, his jaw set. He secured the tarps with duct tape and rope. It was ugly and crude, but it would hold. By sunrise, the greenhouse was sealed again. Not repaired, not restored, but sealed, holding. He made 2 calls that morning. The first was to Glenn. "I need new glass, 3 panes, same size as before." Glenn didn't ask what happened. Maybe he already knew. "I'll have them by Thursday," he said. The second call was to Harold Whitfield. Callum told him everything: the boot prints, the broken glass, the crushed plants, the note. Harold was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality Callum had not heard before. It was the voice of an old man who was angry in the slow, cold way that old men get angry, the kind of anger that doesn't shout but sharpens. "This will not stand," Harold said. "I'm drafting a cease and desist letter to Stone Ridge Holdings today. I will make it very clear that any further contact with you or your property, direct or indirect, will result in legal action. I'll copy the county sheriff in the state attorney general's office." "The sheriff out here," Callum said carefully. "I'm not sure he'd be helpful." "Then we go over his head. Callum, listen to me. You have legal standing, you have a deed, you have property rights. These people are attempting to intimidate you into selling, and that is a crime. Don't let them succeed." Callum looked out through the tarp-covered holes in his greenhouse. Beyond them, his 5 acres of woods stood in the morning light, silent and patient in his. "I'm not selling," he said. "I'm not leaving. Tell them if they step on my land again, I'm calling the federal authorities. Not the local sheriff. Federal. I'll make sure they receive that message," Harold said. And there was something in his voice now that went beyond professional duty. It sounded like pride. He replaced the glass. He rebuilt the trampled beds. He replanted the golden seal from seed, starting the count over at day 1. It was brutal. Not the physical labor which he was used to now, but the psychological weight of watching weeks of progress erased and having to begin again with nothing but patience and the stubborn refusal to be beaten. Glenn came by the next morning with 2 coffees and a bag of donuts from Maze. He also brought something else, a set of battery-powered motion sensor lights. "For the perimeter," he said, handing them over. "Won't stop anyone, but it'll let you know they're coming." He helped Callum mount them on the corners of the greenhouse and the Quonset hut. They worked in near silence, the way men work together when the work itself is the conversation. When they were finished, Glenn stood back and looked at the lights, then at the greenhouse, then at Callum. "Never seen anyone work this hard for a piece of land," Glenn said. It was the longest sentence Callum had ever heard him speak. "Most people would have taken the money and run." "My mother didn't leave me money so I could run," Callum said. "She left me ground so I could stand." Glenn looked at him, then he nodded once and got in his truck and drove away. That night, Callum sat in his reading chair by the wood stove. The Quonset hut was warm. The rain tapped on the metal roof. The motion sensor lights glowed faintly through the window, pale sentinels at the edges of his property. In the greenhouse behind new glass, the ginseng seedlings were pushing upward, reaching for the grow lights, alive and green and relentless. He opened his mother's journal to a page he hadn't read before. Near the back, past the planting schedules and the soil charts, she had written something that wasn't an instruction. It was a reflection. A note to herself, or perhaps to him, or perhaps to no one, just words set down in the quiet of this place on a day when she too had been tired and scared and alone. The hardest thing about growing something is not the planting. It's the waiting. It's trusting that the work you did in the dark will show itself in the light. It's believing in roots you can't see. He closed the journal and held it against his chest. Outside, the woods were dark and quiet, and somewhere in the greenhouse, in the warm soil of a cedar bed, built by his hands, a seed he had planted was reaching downward, sending roots into the earth, anchoring itself to the ground his mother had given him. He was doing the same thing. And no one, not Stone Ridge, not Victor Hale, not the ghost of whatever threat had followed his mother through her short and fearful life, was going to pull him out. Winter arrived the way winter arrives in the northern woods, not all at once, but in stages, each one a little colder, a little darker, a little more honest than the last. First came the color. The oaks and maples on Callum's 5 acres turned in late October, their leaves shifting from green to gold to a deep burning crimson that lit up the tree line like a slow fire. For a few weeks, the property was staggeringly beautiful, the kind of beauty that stops you in your tracks and makes you forget for a moment that beauty is temporary. The Quonset hut sat in the center of it like a silver whale beached in a sea of flame. Then the leaves fell. They fell for days, covering the ground in a thick rustling carpet that muffled his footsteps and filled the air with the dry, papery smell of endings. He raked them into piles and composted them, following his mother's journal, which noted that decomposed oak leaves made excellent acidic mulch for ginseng beds. Even in death, the trees were feeding his future. Then came the cold. It descended in November like a hand pressing down on the land, steady and implacable. The creek slowed. The ground hardened. The mornings arrived wrapped in frost, every surface coated in a thin, glittering skin of ice that caught the first light and held it like a secret. The wood stove became the center of his world. He fed it constantly, the cast iron box radiating a steady, dry heat that pushed back the damp chill of the concrete floor and the metal walls. Glenn had taught him to bank the coals at night, packing them tight so they would burn slow and low until morning. And Callum had learned the particular rhythm of it, the loading, the adjusting of the damper, the satisfying thunk of a well-placed log, the way a man learns any language through repetition and necessity, and the quiet pleasure of competence. He had stockpiled firewood through October, working with a bow saw and a splitting maul he bought at the hardware store, cutting deadfall from the surrounding woods into stove-length rounds and splitting them and stacking them against the north wall of the hut in neat, tight rows. The woodpile grew until it was 6 feet high and 12 feet long, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a full pantry with satisfaction in the particular relief of someone who knows what it means to have nothing. The well pump froze twice in December. Each cold snap was a test, and each test was a reminder of how fragile this whole operation was, how dependent on his vigilance, his presence, his refusal to look away. The ginseng was dormant now. The above-ground growth withered to dry stalks, but the roots were alive beneath the soil, thickening slowly in the dark building, the density and the complexity that would make them valuable in 3, 4, 5 years. He couldn't see the growth. He could only trust it. Trust that the work he had done in the warm months, the careful planting, the precise watering, the patient tending, was continuing underground, invisible in the silence of the frozen earth. His mother's words came back to him. The hardest thing about growing something is the waiting, trusting that the work you did in the dark will show itself in the light. He was learning to wait. The Quonset hut had become, by slow degrees, something that could no longer be called a shelter. It was becoming a home. The transformation had happened the way all real transformations happen, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate acts. A shelf here, a hook there, a curtain hung across the sleeping area made from a canvas drop cloth to create the illusion of a separate room. The reading chair by the stove, its duct-taped arm now so familiar that he couldn't imagine it smooth. A rug, braided and colorful, bought at a church rummage sale in Sterling for $3 laid over the concrete floor to soften the cold. He had mounted the framed photograph of his mother on the wall above his desk, which was a door laid across 2 sawhorses, and every morning when he sat down to update his planting logs, she was there, smiling, squinting in the sun, a smudge of paint on her cheek. He no longer looked at the photo with the sharp, cutting grief of the first weeks. The grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It had become something quieter and deeper, less like a wound and more like a current running beneath everything, powering everything, giving direction to the days. The bookshelves were full. Margot had become his primary supplier, not just of library books, which he devoured and returned with meticulous punctuality, but of recommendations, reading lists, and the kind of literary conversation that made him remember why he had loved English literature in the first place. They talked about books the way some people talk about weather, constantly, casually, with an underlying seriousness that neither of them acknowledged directly. "You've read more in 3 months than most people in this county read in a year," she told him one afternoon, stamping his returns with quick, efficient movements. "And you actually think about what you've read, which puts you ahead of most people everywhere." "I had a good teacher," he said, and he meant his mother, who had read to him every night until he could read to himself, and then had read beside him, the two of them on the couch, each lost in their own book, but together in the act of reading. But Margot took the compliment for herself, and the way her cheeks colored slightly behind her wire-rimmed glasses was something he found himself thinking about later that evening, sitting in his chair by the stove, a book open in his lap but unread. Something was growing there too, something quiet and uncertain and real. He wasn't ready to name it, but he was aware of it, the way he was aware of the ginseng roots beneath the soil, alive, developing, requiring patience. The Saturday breakfast at May's Diner had become a ritual. Callum sat at the counter, always the same stool third from the left, and ate his eggs and drank his coffee and listened to the slow overlapping conversations of the town. He was no longer the stranger. He was the kid on the Hemlock plot, then he was the young man on the Hemlock plot, then by December he was just Callum, and people nodded at him without the initial flicker of curiosity, the way they nodded at everyone else, which was the truest form of acceptance a small town could offer. Walt Pemberton still sat 2 stools down, eating his oatmeal and bacon, and they had developed a relationship built almost entirely on silences and vegetables. Walt brought him things: a bag of seed potatoes in November, a jar of his wife's blackberry preserves in December, a set of pruning shears in January, that he said he had a spare of, though Callum suspected he had bought them new. "How are the tomatoes?" Walt asked one Saturday. "Finished for the season. I canned what I could. 12 jars. Walt nodded. This was from Walt the equivalent of a standing ovation. 12 jars from first-year plants, he said. "Not bad." "The ones you gave me," Callum said. "Your seedlings." Walt looked at his oatmeal. "Wasn't anything special. Just plants." But they both knew that wasn't true. Nothing given freely between people who understand the value of growing things is just anything. It was a hand extended, a stake driven into the ground, a way of saying without the awkwardness of actually saying it, "You belong here." Victor Hale came back in January. Callum was splitting wood behind the Quonset hut, the maul rising and falling in a steady rhythm, each stroke clean and precise, the halves falling apart with a satisfying crack. He had gotten good at this. His body had changed over the months, the lean, bookish frame of the college graduate, replaced by something harder and more capable, the kind of strength that comes not from a gym, but from the daily demands of living close to the ground. He heard the car before he saw it. The sound was wrong for this place, too smooth, too quiet, the purr of an expensive engine on a road built for trucks. A black SUV emerged from the tree line and stopped at the edge of the clearing. The driver's door opened, and Victor Hale stepped out. He looked the same: polished shoes, a coat that cost more than Callum's entire wardrobe, hair combed with geometric precision. But something in his face was different. The easy, predatory confidence of their phone call months ago had been replaced by something tighter, more controlled. The confidence was still there, but it was working harder now. "Mr. Wren," Hale said, approaching with his hands in his pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Callum set the maul down but didn't step away from the chopping block. "You're on my property, Mr. Hale." "I know, and I apologize for the intrusion. But I felt this conversation deserved to happen face to face." He looked around the clearing, taking in the stacked firewood, the repaired greenhouse, the smoke rising from the Quonset hut's stovepipe. His expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or reassessment. This was not the dilapidated ruin he had expected. This was a place being lived in, being built. "We'd like to increase our offer," Hale said. $400,000. All cash fast, closed, no contingencies. You could be out in 2 weeks with more money than most people in this county will see in a decade. 400,000. The number was enormous. It was a life prepackaged and ready to unwrap. An apartment in a city. A car that started on the first try. Years of freedom from financial worry. It was everything the 22-year-old on the dormitory steps had wanted. But Callum was not that person anymore. That person had been shaped by absence, by the absence of money, of family, of a place to stand. This person, the one standing in the cold with calloused hands and wood chips on his boots, had been shaped by presence. By the presence of work, by the presence of the land, by the presence of his mother's voice in every page of the journal, every seat in the greenhouse, every line of her letters. "Who is Dominic Reed?" Callum asked. The change in Hale's face was immediate and involuntary. A tightening around the eyes, a stiffness in the jaw. It lasted less than a second, but Callum saw it, and Hale knew he saw it. "I'm not sure what you mean," Hale said carefully. "I think you are. I think Dominic Reed is your employer. I think he has a personal interest in this land that goes beyond real estate development, and I think you know why." Hale stared at him. The practiced charm was gone now, stripped away, like the last coat of paint on a weathered door. Beneath it was something cold and calculating, but also something else, wariness. The wariness of a man who has underestimated his opponent and is only now realizing the extent of the miscalculation. "Mr. Wren, I would strongly advise you not to pursue that line of inquiry." But the sealed envelope in the bank was an invention, a detail. Callum added because his mother had taught him through her own desperate planning the value of preparation and the power of making your enemy believe you are more protected than you are. Hale stood very still. The cold air moved between them. Somewhere in the woods a crow called harsh and final. "You're making a mistake," Hale said quietly. "My mother made a lot of sacrifices so I could make this particular mistake," Callum said. "I intend to honor every one of them. We're done here, Mr. Hale." Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned, walked to the SUV, got in, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the trees, and then there was silence. And then there was just the woods and the cold, and the smoke rising from the stovepipe, and the sound of Callum's own breathing steady, and even the breathing of a man who has held his ground. He called Harold that afternoon. "Hale came in person," he said. 400,000. I said no. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did he threaten you?" "He advised me." "Same thing from men like that." Harold paused. "Callum, I'm going to file a formal complaint with the county and the state bar. I've also been in contact with a colleague who specializes in land harassment cases. Stone Ridge has a pattern. They've pressured at least 3 other landowners in Sterling County in the past 5 years. 2 of them sold. 1 held on. We're building a case and your documentation is part of it." "They won't come back," Callum said. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but saying it out loud made it feel possible. "No," Harold agreed. "I don't think they will. You've made yourself too expensive to bully. That's the thing about people like Reed. They're looking for easy acquisitions. The moment a target becomes complicated, they move on. There's always easier land." But it wasn't just the legal threat that had turned Hale away. Callum knew that. It was the property itself, the stacked wood, the repaired greenhouse, the smoke from the stove. It was the evidence of habitation, of investment, of a life being built. An empty ruin is easy to acquire. A home is not. His mother had understood that. Build something and it becomes harder to take. Put down roots and the ground holds you. The golden seal was ready in February. It was the first crop to reach a harvestable stage, faster growing than the ginseng, less demanding of time and patience. The plants had filled 2 of the 4 cedar beds, their broad leaves yellow now in winter dormancy, but beneath the soil the rhizomes were thick and dense and bright gold when Callum dug one up to check. His mother's journal had detailed the harvesting process with her usual precision. Cut the above-ground growth. Carefully dig the rhizomes, keeping them intact. Wash them gently. Dry them in a warm, ventilated space. The drying was critical. Too fast, and the rhizomes cracked, losing value. Too slow, and they developed mold. She had specified a temperature range, a humidity level, and a drying duration. He built a drying rack in the Quonset hut, a simple frame of cedar slats suspended above the wood stove, where the warm, dry air rose naturally. He laid the cleaned rhizomes on the slats and monitored them daily, turning them, checking for mold, adjusting the distance from the stove. It took 3 weeks. When they were done, the dried golden seal rhizomes were light and hard and the color of old gold, and they filled a cloth sack that weighed just over 8 pounds. 8 pounds. It seemed like nothing. Months of work of planting and watering and worrying compressed into a sack that he could hold in one hand. But Margot had helped him research the market. She had found through the library's internet connection and her own methodical approach to information, 3 herbal supplement companies that purchased sustainably grown golden seal directly from small farmers. The prices varied, but the range was consistent between $40 and $60 per dried pound for certified, organic, sustainably harvested rhizomes. Callum contacted all three. He sent samples. He waited. The response came from a company in Vermont, a small outfit called Green Hollow Botanicals, that specialized in ethically sourced medicinal herbs. The buyer, a woman with a no-nonsense voice and a series of very specific questions about his growing methods, offered him $52 per pound for his entire harvest with a standing order for future crops. 8 pounds at $52, $416. It was not a fortune. It was barely a month's worth of property taxes. But it was revenue. It was proof. It was the first dollar earned from the ground his mother had chosen, grown from the seeds she had saved, harvested by the hand she had imagined. He deposited the check at the bank in Sterling, and the teller, who knew him by now, said, "First sale." "First sale," he said. "Congratulations," she said. And she meant it in the way that people in small towns mean things personally, specifically with the understanding that everyone's success is in some small way the town's success. The tax bill arrived the same week. It was due in 30 days. The amount was significant, not crushing, but real. Enough to make his stomach tighten when he saw the number. He had the money from the seller, but using it for taxes felt like failure, like dipping into a reserve that was meant for building, not maintaining. He looked at the golden seal drying rack. He looked at the greenhouse where the next batch of golden seal was already growing, planted from the seeds of the harvested plants. He looked at the ginseng beds where the roots were in their second year, still 3 years from harvest, but growing steadily and visibly in the dark. He could do this. Not with the ginseng, not yet, but with the golden seal and with the echinacea that would be ready in the spring and with the black cohosh that would follow in the summer. His mother's plan was not built on a single crop. It was built on a rotation, a staggered sequence of harvests that would generate income in cycles, each one feeding into the next, building momentum like a wheel that, once turning, would be hard to stop. He paid the taxes with the golden seal money and a portion of the savings. The numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. And next year, with more beds in production and the echinacea coming online, they would work better. And the year after that, better still. And in 5 years, when the first ginseng roots were ready, thick, dense, slow-grown roots worth hundreds of dollars per pound, the wheel would be turning on its own. His mother had been right. It was a slow business, a patient business, a business built not on speed or cleverness, but on the willingness to wait, to tend, to trust the ground. Victor Hale had offered him $400,000 for this land. The golden seal had earned him $416. The math was absurd. But the math was also irrelevant because the two numbers measured different things. Hale's money measured the land's value to someone else. The golden seal measured its value to Callum. And those were not the same thing. They were not even the same currency. Spring came back to Sterling County in late March, and it came the way spring comes to places that have earned it, slowly, grudgingly, and then all at once. The snow melted. The creek swelled. The ground softened and darkened, releasing the smell of wet earth that Callum had come to associate with possibility. The trees budded, then leafed the canopy, filling in overhead, until the Quonset hut was sheltered beneath a green cathedral of oak and pine. In the greenhouse, the ginseng woke up. The dormant roots sent up new shoots, pale green stalks that unfurled into leaves with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of things that know exactly what they are doing. The second-year plants were stronger than the first, their stems thicker, their leaves broader. They were established now. Rooted. Callum expanded the operation. He cleared a new section of ground on the east side of the greenhouse and built 2 additional cold frames using scrap glass from the hardware store and cedar planks he milled himself from a fallen tree with a handsaw. The new frames would house the echinacea and a test batch of bloodroot, both of which his mother's journal indicated were ready for outdoor cultivation in this climate zone. It was during this expansion on a cool morning in early April, while digging the foundation trench for the new cold frames along the east wall of the greenhouse, that his shovel struck something. Not metal this time, something lighter. The sound was hollow, muffled by the surrounding soil. He knelt and dug with his hands, working the dirt carefully the way he had learned to work the soil around delicate root systems gently, respectfully, with the awareness that the earth holds things it is not always ready to give up. It was a tin box, small, rectangular, about the size of a cigar box, sealed with electrical tape that had gone brittle and yellow with age. The tape crumbled as he peeled it away. The lid was stiff but not locked. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, were two objects. The first was a USB drive, black and unremarkable. It looked like any other thumb drive, the kind you could buy at a gas station for $10. But it was here, buried in the ground behind a greenhouse in the middle of nowhere, placed there by a woman who had been afraid for her life, which made it something else entirely. The second object was a letter, a single sheet of paper folded twice, written in his mother's hand. But the writing was different from the other letters. It was rushed, the letters cramped and uneven, as if she had written it quickly under pressure, with the knowledge that time was running out. Callum, if you find this, it means they came back. It means the land wasn't enough to keep them away. I hoped this box would stay buried forever. I hoped you would never need what's inside. The USB drive contains everything. Text messages, voicemails I recorded, a ledger of the money I borrowed and from whom. Copies of the threats, dates, names, amounts. It's all there. I kept it as insurance, not for me, but for you. Give it to Harold. He'll know what to do. Don't confront anyone yourself. Don't be brave. Be smart. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't fix this while I was alive. But I could leave you the tools to fix it for yourself, Mom. He sat in the dirt with the tin box in his lap and the USB drive in his palm, and felt the full weight of his mother's foresight settle over him like a blanket made of iron. She had planned for everything, every contingency, every threat, every possible future. She had buried her evidence in layers, each one deeper than the last, each one requiring more work, more time, more commitment to uncover. The first footlocker was hope. The cellar was provision. And this last buried box was protection. She had been a woman living in fear, and she had turned that fear into architecture. Every decision she had made, the land, the hut, the greenhouse, the seeds, the letters, the hidden caches, was a stone in a fortress she was building around her son. Not to keep him in, but to keep the world out, to give him a place so secure, so deeply his, that no one could take it away. He called Harold that afternoon. "I've found something else," he said, "a USB drive, buried behind the greenhouse." She left a note saying it contains evidence. Messages, recordings, financial records. She said to give it to you. Harold was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "I always suspected," he said. "The way she came to me that last week. The urgency, the fear in her eyes. I thought she was being paranoid. I should have pushed harder. I should have asked more questions." "You did what she asked," Callum said. "You protected the trust. You kept the secret. You found me. That's enough." "I'll send a courier for the drive," Harold said. "Don't make a copy. Don't look at what's on it. Let me handle this through proper channels. I have a colleague, a former federal prosecutor, who handles exactly this kind of case. If what's on that drive is what your mother says it is, Stone Ridge and Dominic Reed will have much bigger problems than a land acquisition." Callum agreed. He sealed the drive in an envelope and gave it to Glenn, who drove it to Harold's office the next day. And then he did the hardest thing of all. He let it go. Not the anger, not the grief, but the need to fight, the need to confront Dominic Reed and demand answers about his mother's death, the need to know with certainty whether the accident had been an accident. His mother had told him not to be brave. She had told him to be smart. And smart meant trusting the process, trusting Harold, trusting the law. Smart meant doing the thing he had come here to do, not to solve a mystery, but to build a life. He went back to the greenhouse. He planted the echinacea seedlings in the new cold frames. He watered the ginseng. He checked the golden seal. He did the work. Harold called 6 weeks later. "It's done," he said. The materials on the drive were extensive. Reed's financial records alone were enough to trigger an investigation. The state attorney general has opened a case. Stone Ridge Holdings is under formal investigation for predatory land practices in 3 counties. Reed has retained counsel, which means he's taking it seriously. The company has ceased all acquisition activity in Sterling County. And my mother, Callum asked, the question he had carried since the first letter. The question that lived in his chest like a second heart. Harold paused. The investigation may reopen the circumstances of the accident. I can't promise anything, Callum. These things take time. But the evidence your mother left, it's substantial. She was thorough. She was brave. She was scared, Callum said. She was brave because she was scared. There's a difference. Yes, Harold said softly. There is. The last Saturday in April was warm, the kind of warm that announces itself with bird song and the smell of things blooming and the particular quality of light that comes only in spring, golden and soft and full of the unreasonable optimism that is the earth's greatest gift. Callum sat on the steps he had built at the front of the Quonset hut, real step cedar planks on a frame with a railing he had sanded smooth. The door behind him was open, and through it came the smell of coffee brewing on the wood stove and the faint warm scent of the home he had made inside. The rug, the books, the reading chair, the framed photograph of his mother on the wall. Glenn's truck rattled up the driveway at 8 o'clock as it did every Saturday, and Glenn got out carrying 2 cups of coffee from May's and a paper bag that smelled of sugar and grease. Donuts, he said, handing one of the cups to Callum and settling onto the steps beside him. May says hello. Tell her the eggs were perfect yesterday. Tell her yourself, she likes you. God knows why. They drank their coffee in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of the need to perform for each other. The clearing was bright with spring light. The greenhouse gleamed, every pane intact, the glass clean and catching the sun. Through it, Callum could see the green rows of his plants thriving, ordered alive. A car appeared on the driveway. Not an SUV this time, a small blue hatchback, a little dusty from the gravel road. Margot Sinclair got out carrying a canvas bag and a book. I brought you something, she said, walking us up to the steps. New acquisition at the library, a first edition guide to Appalachian ginseng cultivation published in 1978. I thought you might want first look before I shelve it. You drove out here to bring me a book. I drove out here because it's Saturday and it's beautiful and I wanted to see how the greenhouse looks. She glanced at Glenn. Morning, Glenn. Margot, Glenn said, and took a very deliberate sip of his coffee and looked at the trees with the exaggerated concentration of a man who is trying very hard not to smile. Callum took the book. Their fingers touched briefly, and he didn't pull away, and neither did she, and the moment was small and warm and exactly right. An hour later, Walt Pemberton's truck appeared. Walt got out carrying a flat of strawberry plants because it was spring, and because Walt Pemberton believed that every piece of land deserved strawberries even if he would never say so out loud. He set the flat on the steps and nodded at the assembled group and said, South side, full sun, don't overwater them. And then he sat down on the bottom step and accepted a cup of coffee from Glenn and said nothing else and didn't need to because his presence was the message. He was here. They were all here. On a Saturday morning on the steps of a Quonset hut that had once been a ruin, drinking coffee and eating donuts and talking about plants and books and weather and nothing important and everything important. Callum looked at them. Glenn weathered and steadied his truck, parked at an angle as always because Glenn had never parked straight in his life. Margot sitting on the top step with the book open in her lap, her glasses catching the light. Walt silent and immovable on the bottom step, the strawberry plants beside him like an offering. These people had not been assigned to him by a system. They had not been mandated by a court or a social worker or an institution. They had chosen to be here. They had chosen him and he had chosen them, and the choosing was the thing that made it real. He thought about the word family. He had never had one, not in the way the world defined it. He had had a mother, and then he had had a series of strangers who were paid to keep him alive, and then he had had no one. But family, he understood now, was not a thing you were born into. It was a thing you built, like a greenhouse, like a garden, like a home. You cleared the ground, and you put in the work, and you showed up every day, and you waited. And if you were lucky and stubborn enough, something grew. Later that afternoon, after Glenn had left and Walt had driven away, and Margot had stayed for a second cup of coffee, and then a third, and then they had walked through the greenhouse together while he showed her the ginseng plants, now tall and green and full of quiet promise. Callum went back inside the hut. He sat in his reading chair. The wood stove was cold. He didn't need it today. The spring warmth was enough, but the chair was still the center of his world, the place where he thought and read and planned, and sometimes just sat doing nothing, feeling the particular peace of a man who knows where he is and why. He picked up his mother's journal. He had read every page, some of them dozens of times, but he opened it now to the inside front cover, where she had written something he had overlooked in those frantic first weeks. Something small tucked into the corner, almost hidden. It was a sketch, not a planting diagram or a greenhouse layout, a picture drawn in pencil, small and detailed, and made with the careful hand of an artist who could capture the truth of a thing in a few lines. It was the Quonset hut, but not as he had found it, not rusted and weedy and desolate. She had drawn it as she imagined it would be. The greenhouse was whole, its panes shining. A vegetable garden grew beside the entrance. Smoke rose from a stovepipe. Warm light glowed from the windows. And in front of the hut, standing on the steps, was the figure of a young man. He was small in the drawing, just a suggestion of a person, but he was there. Standing tall, standing still, standing on his own ground. She had seen this, before the cellar, before the letters, before the seeds. She had sat somewhere, probably in this very spot, and she had pictured her son standing exactly where he was standing now, living the life she had built for him to live. The drawing was faded, the pencil lines softened by time, but it was unmistakable. The greenhouse, the garden, the smoke, the light, the man. Beneath the drawing in letters so small he had to hold the journal close to read them, she had written her final words to him. "You were my best crop, Callum, my most beautiful creation." He closed the journal and held it against his chest. The spring light came through the open door, warm and golden, and it fell across the concrete floor and the braided rug and the bookshelves and the photograph of his mother on the wall, and it touched everything, and everything it touched was his. Outside, the greenhouse stood in the afternoon sun, its glass burning with light. Inside, the ginseng roots were growing in the dark, reaching downward, thickening, building the slow, invisible wealth that would take years to harvest. The golden seal was flowering. The echinacea was budding. Walt's tomato plants, second generation now, were already in the ground, and beside them a new row of strawberries pointed their green leaves toward the sky. He had come here with nothing, a duffel bag, a debt, and a dead woman's secret. He had found a ruin and a letter and a box of seeds. And from those things, with his own hands on ground, his mother had chosen, he had built a life. Not a perfect life, not a finished life. The ginseng was still years from harvest. The business was years from real profitability. There were still leaks to patch and beds to build and plans to make. The investigation into Dominic Reed and Stone Ridge was ongoing, its outcome uncertain. The questions about his mother's death remained open, unresolved, a wound that might never fully close. But for the first time in his 23 years on Earth, Callum Wren was standing on solid ground. Not borrowed ground, not temporary ground, not ground that could be taken away by a social worker's decision or a landlord's notice or the expiration of a financial aid package. His ground, paid for by his mother's sacrifice and earned by his own labor and held firmly and finally by the roots he had put down. He thought about what his mother had written in her second letter, the one from the cellar, the one that had told him to live, not just survive. He was living. He stepped outside and stood on the cedar steps and looked out at his 5 acres of Sterling County, and the woods were green and the creek was running, and the air smelled of earth and pine, and the first wildflowers of spring, and the Quonset hut stood behind him, solid and warm, its curved metal walls no longer the shell of something abandoned, but the spine of something alive. His mother had not left him a home. She had left him the ability to build one. And that he understood now was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Not money, not land, not even the seeds, though the seeds were everything. The inheritance was the belief that your own 2 hands are enough, that the ground will hold you if you're willing to hold on to it, that the work you do in the dark, the planting, the waiting, the trusting will show itself in the light. The ginseng roots were still growing. Small, hidden, patient. They would be ready in 3 years, maybe 4. He was not in a hurry. For the first time in his life, he had time. He had ground. He had home. The evening came slowly, the way evenings come in spring, the light lingering, reluctant to leave. Callum sat on his steps and watched the shadows lengthen across the clearing, and he listened to the woods settle into their nighttime rhythms, and he felt something he had never felt before. Not in any foster home, not in any dormitory, not in any place he had ever been. He felt planted. And in the greenhouse, in the warm soil of cedar beds built by his hands, watered by a creek that ran through his land, sheltered by glass his mother had dreamed of, and he had installed, the roots grew deeper.